Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to the J. Winfield Fretz Visiting Scholar Lecture of 2020. I'm Marlene Epp, the Director of the Mennonite Studies program here at Conrad Grebel University College, and I'm pleased to welcome you here on behalf of all of my colleagues. You are here, of course, to hear one of my colleagues, Dr. David Y. Neufeld, speak on the topic Where Moth and Rust Destroy Archives and the Contest over Anabaptist Information. I acknowledge that we are living and working on the traditional territory of Indigenous peoples, the Huron-Wendat, Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee. The first Mennonite settlers arrived in what is today Waterloo region in the early 1800s. This was less than 20 years after the Haldimand Proclamation of 1784 granted this land to the Haudenosaunee, known as Six Nations. The Haldimand Tract is 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River from end to end. I also acknowledge that it's a time of anxiety and uncertainty in our world. And I am happy that you are here tonight. And I encourage us to join our hearts and our minds together, even while we are maintaining social distance. For those of us who are non-huggers, this is our time. You may have walked through the atrium and seen a reception set up. Unfortunately, we are not able to offer you that reception tonight. Just a few minutes ago, actually, the university issued new directives on gatherings of large numbers. So while I was hoping for a big crowd tonight, I was hoping for a not super big crowd tonight. But I'm happy that you came out. So if you had a particular yankering for Conrad Grebel cookies, please come back in the next few months where I'm sure we'll be offering them again. So I apologize for that. If you want to visit with David and others afterwards, I suggest we do that up here in the foyer outside the chapel, and then we'll leave from there. Anything else I need to mention in that regard? This is the third year we are offering the Fretz Lecture, given by a scholar who holds the J. Winfield Fretz Fellowship in Mennonite Studies. The fellowship was made possible by generous donors to the college who wanted to advance research, teaching, and public education about Anabaptist and Mennonite themes. It is named after Conrad Grebel's first president, J. Winfield Fretz, whose research specialty was Mennonite sociology from South America to Waterloo County. We are delighted to have David Neufeld on campus this year. In addition to holding the Fretz Fellowship this year, Dr. Neufeld is in the first of a 2-year appointment as visiting assistant professor of history. Indeed, David has already taught 2 courses today, right? The history of the Western world and the history of Christianity. David is also teaching our Reformation era history courses, and next year I think we'll teach a course on colonial Latin American history, one of his specialties. David is no stranger to this community. He grew up here and completed a bachelor's degree in history at University of Waterloo in 2009. After that, he sought out some sun, as well as one of the world's best graduate programs in the history of early modern Europe. He completed both a master's and a PhD at the University of Arizona in 2018. His dissertation topic was Marginal Coexistence, Anabaptists Between Persecution and Toleration in Reformed Zurich, 1585 to 1650. He's currently working on a book manuscript arising from that research. David has published articles, essays, and reviews in the 16th Century Journal, Mennonita Helvetica, and Mennonite Quarterly Review. He's a regular presenter at academic conferences, including the significant 16th Century Conference. His recent topics there have included under the guise of Christian charity, Anabaptist responses to poverty in Reformed Zurich, and knowledge production and repressive action, Anabaptist Reformed relations in Zurich's archives. His 16th century interests cross oceans, however, and include research titled Reconsidering Columbian Canoas, Indigenous Technology and Colonial Transportation along the Magdalena River, 1525 to 1600. David's interest also goes well beyond the 16th century. He explores global Mennonite history in his 2016 book, Common Witness, a story of ministry partnership between French and North American Mennonites, 1953 to 2003. David's presence and activity here at Conrad Grebel contribute to a long and vibrant history of scholarship and teaching in Anabaptist and Mennonite history. David is married to Gina Martinez, who's here. Spanish is the language of their home, but David is also proficient in German and French. He attends First Mennonite Church in Kitchener, and he follows sports and politics, neither of which are bringing him much joy right now. Welcome, David.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Marlene, and I'd just like to echo your thanks to everyone for being here, given the circumstances. Also, thank you to those who have donated to the Fretz Foundation and the kind of support that's given my research. This talks about how people at different points in time have created historical knowledge about Anabaptists. And so I thought I'd begin by telling you a bit how I made my way into this project. As a doctoral student in Tucson, the dreaded moment when I had to nail down a dissertation project had arrived. And I remember my sense of relief when I came across a research note written by Arnold Snyder that made reference to a trove of records in Zurich State Archive, thousands of pages in all, that documented the experience of Anabaptists in that city's territory until about 1650. The piece piqued my interest for two reasons. First, the mass of material suggested that Swiss Anabaptism was a much bigger phenomenon than I had appreciated before. At that point, Zurich featured in my understanding of Anabaptist history primarily as an origin point, the site of the first adult baptisms in January 1525. The intensity of subsequent violence against the early movement and its leaders, including the man after whom this college is named, and his colleague Felix Muntz, whose execution is depicted in this particular artistic work, had driven survivors along a path into separation, rendering them irrelevant to subsequent Anabaptist history, I thought. The fact of Anabaptist survival, and in significant numbers in rural areas controlled by the city, would allow me to explore how marginalized nonconformists coexisted alongside a Reformed majority for a period of more than 100 years. Second, and I can now admit, more excitingly, this research note offered me the possibility of an actual feasible dissertation project. Most of the material had already been gathered into collections of Täuferakten, or Anabaptist records. The cost of living in Switzerland is obscene, and the fact that archivists had already located what I assumed was the relevant information for me would make it possible for me to do the research that I needed to do in a short period of time on a grad school budget. As I read through this material, a few unexpected patterns began to arise. One was the uneven chronological distribution of the documents. Since these were mostly legal documents produced as records of authorities' prosecution of Anabaptists, I understood this distribution as a kind of imperfect indicator of uneven intensity of the authorities' repression. And we kind of see with the lighter orange part of the graph, those documents organized by year that belong to these collections of Anabaptist records, graphed against references to Anabaptists in the city council minutes. So there's some lining up there. Why would authorities who had constant concern about Anabaptists in their territory only occasionally translate that concern into repressive action? Part of the answer I found is that certain activities, like illegal patterns of movement or clandestine marriages or targeted withdrawal from Reformed parish life, made Anabaptist religious culture, religious life, which usually played out in secret, visible in a way, in a provocative way to the members of the Reformed majority. Often these types of acts triggered a repressive response. And information about the government's interactions with Anabaptists was produced in the form of written documents. So you have this kind of equation. Anabaptist actions, repressive response, and document production. But I also noticed something else. I saw that in certain instances, this equation could be inverted. Some document producing and keeping practices within Zurich's government, in other words, bureaucratic practices, could in certain instances actually stimulate or intensify persecution. In short, the documents and document collections I'd been using not only held evidence about the existence of tension between religious opponents that I could use in my own study. This information and the ways in which this information was organized and weaponized back then had already played a role in allowing the authorities to repress Anabaptists more effectively. These documents both reflected conflict and also generated conflict in some way. So what implications did this have for my understanding of Swiss Anabaptism during this period more broadly? And the rest of my talk kind of provides an introduction to some of the ways that I've been thinking about these archive questions. So what I'm about to share represents in some ways a reorientation of the way I'm practicing research to approach archives as historical phenomena that require analysis in their own right. We see archives here not as neutral repositories of evidence, but places where people have produced, organized, and systematized information in pursuit of specific goals over time. In recognizing this, I think we have the possibility to enrich and revise some of our accounts of Anabaptist history. So I'll proceed with the rest of my talk as follows. I'll say a bit more about my approach, I'll call the social history of archives, talk about record producing and record keeping practices in Europe, specifically during the 16th and 17th centuries. Spend most of my time working through an example of how this kind of information, there was a fight over information control. And then finally, I'll conclude with some general comments about how some of the implications of this research might play out in future Anabaptist research. So for the purposes of this talk, when I reference archives, I'm talking about one, collections of documents and other materials stored permanently for posterity, and two, the places in which those materials are kept. Archives are special things for historians. From the very beginnings of the historical profession, they've been enshrined as the true historian's laboratory, a place where when you're given privileged access, you can quote unquote discover precious materials and the information they contain about the past. While historians have long developed methods and techniques to analyze critically the texts in archival documents themselves, they've tended to approach the archive uncritically, as a treasury of reliable facts, an elusive store whose cache is waiting to be discovered. It's only more recently, in conversation with archivists, who of course have discovered these documents long before the historians ever get there, that historians have begun to question why they've treated archives as places of research without any history of their own. There are a number of principles that have come out of this thinking that are relevant to my own evaluation of Anabaptist information in archives. The first is that archives are information management systems that reflect the time in which they're made. Practices specific to past European archival cultures have placed constraints on the categorization of the information that you can find there. Archival collections therefore fit us with interpretive straitjackets, which are often invisible to us. Secondly, an archives organization represents the ideals of those who created it. Paying attention to the way an archive is structured can reveal how the archive's creators understood the relationship between the different people, groups, and social phenomena that are documented there. A government's archival organization can reveal the common sense by which relationships between these different groups were seen. So if we want to know how Zurich's authorities viewed and related to the Anabaptists in their territory, it's worth paying attention to how they organized and used information about them. Last point, modern archives are themselves the product of historical processes. Like individual documents, archives collections have their own transmission history. They've sometimes made their own journey through time and space. We can't understand the historical evidence that archives contain without accounting for the extent to which events in intervening years have molded the presentation, interpretation, and ordering of that evidence. So if we need to understand the history of the archive in order to understand the information contained within it, it's worth exploring briefly what general trends shaped the creation of archives in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, and how these trends impacted archival work in Zurich. So a few words about the archival logic that shaped the collections that I've worked with. In the Middle Ages, the word archivum reflected an understanding of the archive as a treasury of precious instruments, especially records in documentary forms that allowed the powerful to demonstrate proof of their claims about what had really happened in the past. Materials like the one we see here, the kind of founding document of the Confederation of Switzerland, Federal Charter of 1291, these weren't tools of everyday governance. Often the authority of the person who was interpreting the document mattered more than the authority of the text that was inside the document. So the performance around the presentation of the document often mattered more than the content of the document. But beginning in the late 15th century and throughout the period we're discussing, documents came to be seen as sources of information by themselves. For the first time, political actors expected to become informed by reading documents, something that might seem like common sense to us, but was an innovation. Text became more important than performances. I should say an innovation in terms of governance. People had learned things from reading before that. This transition, which led to what one historian has labeled the birth of the archive, was a lengthy and complex process linked to more intensive governance. It was also reliant on the increased availability of cheap paper, changes in the way that secretaries worked, and the reorganization of documentary repositories. These factors allowed governments to create information states in which they held a monopoly on information about their population. And here we can see kind of one popular depiction of kind of proliferation of written documents. This outside of an official archive in a village lawyer's office. This is by Peter Bruegel the Younger 1621. The accumulation of documents demanded space, which was often in short supply. Before the 19th century, archives were almost never housed in purpose-built structures. Rather, they were held in rooms in existing buildings. And for security and symbolism, these were often towers or churches, sacristies, etc. So on the left here, you can see a depiction of Zurich's Fraumünster, which is one of the kind of larger churches near the center of the city, which held various parts of the city's and the state's archives from the 16th all the way till the 19th century. Cabinets facilitated the subdivision and localizing of records, like the ones depicted here, both from Zurich. In 1646, when Zurich's archive was reorganized, it was put into 8 different cabinets and 475 boxes. Designated officials organized and managed these collections. These men, and they were almost all men, were initially crisis managers brought on to address specific bureaucratic challenges. But over time, archivists became well-salaried government officials who went through dedicated training programs, who developed professional identities and began to theorize about their work. So they came to defend certain ideals in their practice. One was that they were supposed to arrange these documents for the purposes of accessibility to active governors, to inform those who governed. So during the period under study, archivists often complained about archival disorganization, especially once they took up the job from their predecessor. They talked about drowning in a sea of paper. And so in response, they employed or developed information management tools, inventories and registries, bundles and bound books, and developed specialized vocabulary to describe these different processes. They also engaged in textual interpretation of the documents by copying, note-taking, excerpting, etc. These archivists defended the principle of immobility of archival materials. They created rules to limit, monitor, regulate, and organize the movement of documents both inside and outside the archive. And this wasn't ideal. It wasn't a realization. These documents were constantly moving, but there were efforts to get a grip on this situation. And in large part, that was to protect the secrecy of the documents. The information contained in archives was of interest to a wide range of political actors. In order to maintain political power, it was vital that these materials remained in the custody of the authorities who produced them. Archivists served as gatekeepers in a way, giving access only to those who worked in keeping with the government's purposes. These were not public archives that were open to the citizenry more generally. I should say this kind of more systematized way of dealing with documents didn't get rid of this treasury idea. So the head of the Zurich Church in 1633 talked about the church's archive as its most holy deposit. And the autographs of Heinrich Bullinger, one of the great reformers of the city, as relics, he described them. If you know anything about Reformed theology, there's some problems there. But he was describing these documents as having spiritual value of some kind. Practically, these measures did reshape how officials deployed archival information. Rather than a passive collection of defensive tools, the classified archive became a tool for active governance. Hardly surprising in a world in which many rulers were energetic in their objective of seeking information about their population in order to exert tighter control over them. One final point on archival logic. Almost all archival plans during the period concentrated on a document's content or its pertinence as an organizational principle. In other words, secretaries and archivists grouped documents according to what they were about. More recent archival practice has replaced this principle with that of provenance. Materials are organized in relation to the person or institution that created them. So I took a bit of a screenshot of the homepage of the Mennonite Archives of Ontario upstairs. And there's a paragraph right here that says, "You will notice that unlike library collections, which are often organized by subject or author, archival records are usually organized by the creator, individual, or group that generated them." That's the provenance principle. But for some reason, in Zurich in the 19th century, after this provenance principle had already been put in place, they kind of doubled down on the old pertinence principle. They bundled files that had accumulated over centuries in various government offices and reformed them, organizing them into abstract categories, like Anabaptist records, Täuferakten. When I began to use collections of records in Zurich, I assumed I was dealing with documents gathered then by modern archivists. But as I'll now show, this wasn't entirely the case. So in theory, access to an ordered archive allowed rulers to guide their actions by informing themselves about past circumstances, leading them to engage more effectively in disputes with their opponents. This general trend of information accumulation was always more likely to negatively impact groups that were already stigmatized in some way, like the Anabaptists. Indeed, the following examples show that the processing, collection, and reorganization of documents functioned to justify repression against nonconformists. Throughout the period of Reformed Anabaptist coexistence in Zurich from 1525 to 1650, sentencing documents provide evidence of a pattern of accumulation of records in the city's archives relevant to Anabaptists. These collections gave officials easy access to information concerning nonconformist past interactions with the city government. And reference to these materials contributed to officials' knowledge about who they were dealing with. It gave them kind of a memory aid and gave them grounds to increase the severity of punishment for repeat offenders. This was especially important because the bureaucracy cycled through, so it allowed a next generation of officials to remember that the previous ones had dealt with these folks already. So for instance, a scribal inscription attached to a 1618 interrogation of the Anabaptist Jakob Wetzel and Bashi Rugstuhl notes that all documents concerning actions and sentences against Wetzel could be found with other Anabaptist materials among the acts of prisoners from 1616. In this instance, it's clear that officials working in the archive were extracting bundles of documents concerning Anabaptists from larger legal files, organized by year. I want to focus more on a more extensive case that shows how officials used archives to turn information pertinent to Anabaptism into knowledge about Anabaptists that could be used to damage and ostracize them. It comes from the decade between 1635 and 1645, a period during which Zurich City Council mounted a large-scale anti-Anabaptist operation that included mass arrests, property confiscation, child separation, long-term incarceration, and deportation, which managed to largely erase the existence of Anabaptists in the territory. Here we have the convent, the repurposed convent that was used to hold several dozen Anabaptists. It was where about a dozen died during this period. These measures were controversial, both domestically, in other words, within the communities that Anabaptists were living in the territory around the city, and in the eyes of certain foreign observers, including Dutch Reformed authorities and their Mennonite constituents. I'll say a bit more about them later. But this controversial quality to these actions resulted in a contest, a fight over the collection, organization, and publication of information about what had happened, who Anabaptists were in Zurich, and whether they really represented a threat. In the late 1630s, Zurich's authorities determined to engage in this public relations battle by publicizing a justification of their actions. Historians have focused their attention on the resulting printed work, which is depicted on the slide, what became known as the Manifest, what the authorities claimed was a true report of their treatment of nonconformists in the territory between 1635 and 1639. The work takes the form of a standard chronological narrative, which emphasizes Anabaptist deceitfulness and intransigence and justifies the authorities' harshest actions as measures of last resort, a fulfillment of their divine obligation to safeguard the spiritual unity of the territories that were under their control. What I've found is that this particular work was just a kind of tip of the iceberg, the only publicly visible element of a much bigger internal project to compile, reorder, edit, copy, comment on, and synthesize archival materials about Anabaptists, thereby transforming the information these archives contained into knowledge of Anabaptist treachery. So here's a list of the works that I've connected to this effort so far. I'll say more about them. I won't need to translate them except for a couple of kind of key words. I'd like to illustrate the significance of Zurich's project through a number of observations. The first one is that archivists were deeply implicated in this project. Many of the descriptive titles of these different works include terminology linked to information management practices. So we have words like Sextan, which is literally a quire of paper of a certain number of pages. I now have become familiar with the word quire. You can go look it up afterwards. We have terminology like the summarische Deduktion, deduction being a kind of form of reasoning that takes certain true premises and extracts a logical conclusion. In other words, I'm taking the truth from these documents and coming to kind of a logical interpretation of these documents. We have Bericht, report, and its continuation, multiple volumes of the same story. All of this illustrates a certain level of experimentation with form, a trial process in which both archivists and high-ranking churchmen, and I should have introduced him before, the head of Zurich's church, Johann Jakob Breitinger, probably the most powerful man in the city, collaboration between these folks and conversations about how best to publicize this information. What was the best way to take these immobile archival materials designed to remain confidential inside the archive, get them out of the archive, and publicize them in a way that would allow the authorities to achieve their objective of kicking the Anabaptists out of the territory? A letter from Johann Jakob Breitinger, this head of Zurich's church, to the city's principal scribe illustrates that the answer to this question wasn't immediately obvious. In other words, this printed work was not the idea from the beginning. So what was the initial idea? This is the earliest version of what might be taken. It's just a collection of copied documents that are bundled together. In other words, it's kind of just like raw materials. It's not even written by the same scribe. There's different hands involved. It's kind of collaborative project to bring together the information necessary. But Breitinger writes back to the archivist, the city's principal scribe, in a letter on the left, and he says, this isn't going to work. We need a kind of a more narrative story. And I have some suggestions about which narrative elements you might want to highlight. And you can see on the right here a kind of draft of this final printed work in which he's making a lot of annotations and suggestions about how this is, what the final product should look like. And we can kind of see some intermediary steps along the way. So if this previous slide was the kind of first step, we get a kind of closer to this narrative synthesis. We have a single hand. This particular work is almost 200 pages, which combines documents with kind of certain authorial connecting points. Finally, we get to something like a last draft before printing. This is from this continuation. And you can see on the right that primary source excerpts, these archival documents, direct copies are indicated by the quotation marks, but they're kind of directly integrated into a story. And then we finally get to the kind of printed version as the final version. So these examples illustrate how important the material character of these documents are to interpretation. It matters how many people were involved in writing them. It matters how the pages were arranged. It matters how clean the page looks. All of this affects our interpretation of this. Last point is that these documents or document collections are now spread across multiple archival sections in 2 different archives. So the history of the way these collections have moved through time obscures these documents' relationship to one another in some way. So what again does this example show? That during the period under study, authorities embarked on a significant project to collect, reorganize, and process archival information about Anabaptists for the purposes of repression. The archive was a place of human interaction in which the power imbalances of the time shaped people's ability to access and use that information. These documentary collections still exist today, but are categorized in a way that obscures the conditions of their creation and the ways they limit what we can know about the people that were involved in this conflict. I think I'll just briefly skip past this example. This is just to illustrate that this use of archival documents as a kind of set of primary sources to write anti-Anabaptist works continues beyond the expulsion of Anabaptists from Zurich. So this is a much larger work written by Johann Heinrich Ott, the latter sections of which are based on documents that he had lifted right out of Zurich's archive and taken with him. They never made their way back. They ended up, there's a long trajectory, but they're in Bavarian State Library after having passed through, about a dozen people's hands along the way. So while marginalized and targeted by the authorities and generally disempowered by the structures of Swiss society, Zurich's Anabaptists were not defenseless in the face of these attacks. They too engaged in a contest to control how information about who they were was produced, gathered, and shared. Obviously, there were imbalances to this fight. Reformed officials and churchmen exerted control over political information on account of their positions. For minority groups, the communication of non-written information via oral interactions or ceremonies connected to collective worship was clearly more important. At the same time, scholars have noted that the centralization and growth of political archives was accompanied by the proliferation of documentary practices among a much wider circle of people, including semi-literate people. In other words, everyday folks from all walks of life were creating, using, storing, interacting with documents in different ways. So did Anabaptists create an alternative archive? Were they keeping documents in specific locations in ways analogous to the authorities? Probably not really. Other minority groups kind of at the same time did begin to construct what some scholars have called counter archives. In other words, parallel archives that were designed to counter the official narratives of history. But all the kind of significant Anabaptist authored documents that still exist today do so mostly in official archives, where they ended up after they were confiscated during disputes, arrests, or home raids. Here we have a depiction of a raid on a night gathering in the woods, and at the center is a man holding a book. So this is how some of these materials ended up in the authorities' hands. Furthermore, we need to recognize that documents produced by the government represented the power of those who exercised lordship. In other words, state archives held an arsenal of documents that could be weaponized in ways that other types of documents couldn't be. So how do we understand how Anabaptists engaged in this conflict over information? We can pay attention to how they made, used, and kept documents. So how did they make them? One of the reasons why scholars have paid less attention to Swiss Anabaptism after the decade of the movement's origins is the impression that these communities produced few written documents of any interest, and those which did circulate were theologically unoriginal. This picture is problematic for a few reasons. First, it underplays the depth of Swiss Anabaptist commitment to disseminating information in documents. A number of scholars, both here and in Europe, have uncovered an extensive and complex manuscript tradition, handwritten manuscripts, that emerged among Swiss Anabaptists in the latter decades of the 16th century. The existence of this tradition demonstrates that Anabaptists, like other European commoners of the time, participated in an industry of manuscript production that wasn't replaced by printed documents, but ran alongside it. Anabaptists maintained access to physical materials needed to create documents, cheap paper, ink, and to the intellectual resources required to forward new arguments. The form of the manuscript was perfectly suited to their purposes. It allowed nonconformists to produce and reproduce information in written form while evading the censorship that the authorities put on printed materials. This idea about the kind of intellectual poverty of later Swiss Anabaptists is also problematic because it's based on anachronistic assumptions about who an author is. Today, we tend to associate authorship with individualized brilliance and inspiration. But during the period, we're discussing the practice of compilation, sorting, selecting, summarizing, synthesizing excerpts of existing texts into a new work, what I call in my class plagiarism, was an accepted way of producing knowledge. The most learned Europeans of the era dedicated much of their time to compiling as a means of integrating ancient knowledge with new humanist and proto-scientific observations. So here we have a kind of example from Conrad Gessner's notebook. He's one of the kind of principal intellectuals of his day, actually from Zurich. And you can see how he cuts up and annotates these different chunks of text, which eventually are printed in erasing the kind of draft work that you see here. So this was a highly learned practice, but it was particularly suited to Anabaptist purposes. Compiling was a practice that was collaborative and often anonymous. This aligned with Anabaptist emphases on humility and collective discernment and expression and their desire not to put their name down on paper anywhere. It was normal that compilers would decontextualize fragments of text or make silent changes to the excerpts themselves, and this allowed Anabaptists to shape and reshape their arguments using the same texts in ways that served their changing purposes. Finally, compiling provided uneducated Anabaptists with a means of giving themselves credibility by referencing big names, authoritative authors outside of their community. For example, when Anabaptists were arguing with Lutheran and Reformed theologians about the freedom of the conscience, they would constantly cite Luther and Zwingli. So how are these documents used? One of the principal factors that stimulated these compilation projects was the frequent demand to either respond in writing to theological challenges from Reformed authorities or to make arguments in search of toleration. Anabaptists modified documents, reorganizing and adapting information about themselves and their practices and beliefs according to the specific needs that they had in a given situation. We can observe this process by looking at one manuscript tradition that developed after a disputation in Frankenthal in southern Germany in 1571 between Anabaptists and Swiss brethren. And here I'm drawing again on Arnold Snyder's work. So these are different works that belong to this particular manuscript tradition. They take different forms. A letter, a much larger, this Codex 628 is the lengthiest of these documents. They appear in different places, in Zurich, in Basel, in Bern. Sometimes they're personalized, sometimes they're anonymous. The content of this particular slide is less important than the kind of lines between them, which indicate how much textual borrowing there was between these different works. They were connected thematically and often used the exact same copied texts. They also shared emphases with the kind of Anabaptist response to all these histories that I've just described. The 1639 publication by the authorities, the Manifest, elicited an Anabaptist anti-manifest 6 years later. In this final document, Swiss compilers drew on a resource that had been sent to them by Dutch Mennonite collaborators who were in much more stable circumstances, many of which were wealthier and much more educated. Dutch Mennonites had put together a huge collection of these texts that would prove useful to them so they could deploy them against their Reformed opponents. So in the section that argued in favor of limiting government intervention in church affairs, the authors referenced in order of citation Tertullian, the Council of Nicaea, Basil the Great, the Synod of Toledo, Bernard of Clairvaux, Ambrose, the martyrs John and Paul, Leo I, Origen, Augustine, John of Damascus, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, and Sebastian Frank. Scattershot. If they said something that serves me, we're using it. This lent greater theological sophistication to what remained a pretty basic Swiss Anabaptist argument. In each of these works, Anabaptists strategically deployed information to pursue their own survival. And even the fact of these ongoing contacts between the Dutch Mennonites and Swiss Anabaptists demonstrates the ways in which Swiss Anabaptists shaped their own story, probably putting it down in certain instances in documentary form to convince the Dutch to intervene in internal Swiss affairs. It's in fact quite possible that the Zurich City Council published the Manifest in the first place in order to dispel accounts circulated by Swiss Anabaptists transnationally, which emphasized the injustice that these Anabaptists were experiencing. All right, last point in this section, keeping documents. I haven't been able to turn up a great deal of information on Swiss Anabaptist everyday storage practices. We know that these nonconformists hid manuscripts in their possession. Hired thugs turned Anabaptist houses inside out to find them. A lot of these documents have kind of tattered edges, which indicate that they also carried them on their person. Over the longer term, it's clear that Anabaptists guaranteed the preservation of highly valued documents by encouraging their transfer from manuscript, from handwritten documents, to the more durable medium of print. Just give you a few examples. Handwritten first-hand accounts of the testimony of martyrs ended up in printed martyrologies. So here on the very far left, we have a handwritten account of the death of Hans Landis, the last Anabaptist to be executed in Zurich in 1614, that eventually made its way into the Martyr's Mirror, a huge Dutch martyrology. You can see how the introduction of that text is framed. Having come into possession of an extract of a letter written by a preacher at Zurich, we have thought proper to append so much of it here as may serve for information. Collective histories of suffering were appended to hymn books. Here on the left, you see the Ausbund, the most important Swiss Anabaptist hymnal, that in all of its North American editions has a lengthy history of Anabaptist suffering during this decade that I've been referencing. A true report of the brethren in Switzerland in the region of Zurich concerning the tribulations which came upon them for the sake of the gospel from 1635 to 1645. Letters were incorporated into devotional works. This is a kind of Swiss Brethren devotional work called Golden Apples in Silver Bowls, which includes, among different prayers and hymns and other things, letters from various members of the larger Swiss Brethren community, some of whom had been killed. In each of these cases, Anabaptists took information created by members of their communities out of the context of its initial use and repurposed it. So while losing the capacity to inform their readers, these documents took on the quality of monuments to the faithfulness of Anabaptist predecessors, markers of belonging to an enduring Christian tradition. From this point forward, Anabaptists kept these documents as much to preserve identity as to hold their persecutors accountable. All right, last section. I'd like to point to a few ways in which some of the themes that I've been talking about, especially the reproduction and use of state archive collections, have shaped the writing of Anabaptist history more recently. In order to do so, let's return to the earlier discussion of the principles of archival organization, this pertinence versus provenance principle. Officials in the 16th and 17th centuries determined which materials to group together based on the supposed relevance of a document's information to the category Anabaptist, taking them out of different sections of the city's archive. In the last 100 years or so, when scholars of Anabaptism began to publish the contents of these archival documents in critical source editions, they adopted more or less the same pertinence principle. They extracted interrogation records, government correspondence, mandates, financial accounts out of European archives based on the perceived relevance to their topic of interest, usually the radical Reformation in a specific territory. These volumes are remarkable works of scholarship, and they've made it possible for people that don't have access to the archives themselves to study the past. Yet because of the space limitations inherent to a bound book, they often kind of took the easy route by largely reproducing existing collections that they found in archives. And the editorial notes that accompany these volumes contain little or no reflection on that reality, no consideration of how these original collections came to be or how this unseen process might impact our interpretation of the information they hold. And I argue the shape of these archival collections has impacted interpretation to some degree. I think the most obvious example of this is the reliance on collections of Anabaptist records has led us to overemphasize Swiss Anabaptists' separation from the rest of society. These collections leave the impression that Anabaptist withdrawal from society was the defining act that shaped relationships between nonconformists and members of the Reformed majority. On the Anabaptist side, separation is the action that signals membership in an alternative religious community. It embodies the demand for believers to distance themselves from the corrupting influence of the world. On the Reformed side, separation is the act that makes Anabaptists' seditious intent visible, and it justifies repression of them. And a reading of Anabaptist and Reformed theological writings produced to emphasize distinctives in a polemical environment only reinforces this view. In short, the archive, because of the conditions of its creation, is designed to highlight supposedly unreconcilable difference between these groups. But other evidence exists that casts some doubt or tempers this image to some degree. There are few instances where archives contain source collections from the 16th and 17th century that are organized not by pertinence but by provenance. That is, records produced by officials in one institution that haven't been broken up. These are often protocol books or books of meeting minutes, the record of proceedings of the city council, or of greatest importance here, local morals courts, which were institutions in which villagers worked out their problems before they got sent along to the city for further prosecution. This type of record, in which information hasn't been cut up, fragmented, and reordered, demonstrates that Anabaptists remain deeply embedded in the economic, social, and religious life of these rural communities. Anabaptist women, who tend to be underrepresented in more formal legal underrepresented in more formal legal sources, appear much more frequently in these protocol books. These sources demonstrate this complicated reality precisely because they don't lend themselves to the extraction of information deemed relevant to Anabaptism from an institutional, documentary, or archival context. In these records, Anabaptists are literally positioned among their Reformed neighbors and family members. As you can see in this document, January record in the village of Biermannsdorf, right outside of Zurich, the only Anabaptist brought before the court is a guy named Stefan Zander. All the other folks who showed up that day had no relationship to Anabaptism. So they're tolerated and admonished and disciplined among other community members, mostly ruffians, troublemakers, and drunks, and Anabaptists were occasionally those same folks. This observation, based on attention to archival forms and organization, holds some implications for the way that we understand who Swiss Anabaptists were and how conditions of repression shaped the relationship between their theology, lived religion, and engagement with broader society. So my concluding point. In large part, this presentation has concerned itself with how information becomes knowledge, how relatively raw, specific, practical details are cooked, processed, and systematized to authoritatively shape our understanding of reality. We've seen a few instances of this. Looked at how Zurich's government took information residing in the archive and managed and processed it in a way to create damaging knowledge about Anabaptists living in their territory. At the same time, we've shown how Anabaptists use a whole different set of means to translate information about their own experiences of suffering into knowledge of their innocence in a way that directly counteracted the authorities' accusations and invited others to show solidarity and to offer support. Today, in our own context, we engage and are implicated in similar contests over information. We've never had such ready access to more information, but are often funneled into information bubbles. We're informed differently than those around us, and often through different channels. We create and reproduce knowledge on these limited sets of information for our own individual and collective purposes. Because of this, we're rightly alert to the threat of misinformation as a means to deceive and to malign. We should be equally sensitive to how the information management institutions of the present, news gathering organizations, tech companies, governments, themselves constrain what we can know. When we seek and process information, what interpretive straitjackets are we being fitted with? Who's being made visible or invisible by the ways that we're informed? What is remembered and what is forgotten? Considering these questions can help us re-examine our own certainties, what we know, especially when what we come to know encourages the marginalization or repression of vulnerable people. Despite real barriers, those who experience marginalization maintain the power to inform those with ears to hear about their own beliefs, practices, and experiences, and integrating this information into what we know can spur us also to solidarity and support. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, David. I think our past and present archivists in the room are probably thinking, finally, someone gets how complex we are and how political we are.
Right.
So David is willing to take responses or questions, and I'll let you manage that.
Sure. Yes?
Yeah, you talk about the birth of the archive and the period 1400 to 1700 on your slides, and I'm thinking that kind of corresponds to the period of the rise of the printing press.
Mm.
And you allude to some sort of printed works in your presentation, but I'm thinking that the rise of the printing press had any impact at all on the work of archivists in that period?
Yeah, more marginal than you might expect. So obviously, print, the kind of invention of movable type and production of millions and millions of printed works has some kind of impact on a European information order. So if you look back on those Gessner slides, a lot of those excerpts were taken out of printed works. And printed works allowed archivists to disseminate their theories and their ideas to a much greater extent. So to that degree, print does have an impact on this birth of an archive. But in terms of the kind of everyday practices of managing information, it also goes for government. Print was more marginal and didn't replace this kind of manuscript culture that existed until much later. Yeah. Yeah.
David, could you clarify? Great talk, by the way. First grade. Could you clarify, in this example you have on the screen right now?
Yeah.
The little section in red is what's pertinent, but it stayed with that document. In the cases that you're talking about where they load an archive, according to Anabaptists, that category, would this whole document have been removed and placed in that archive, or would they have copied this section, or how does that work?
No, so usually entire documents are placed in these Anabaptist collections. And that means that certain kinds of documents are overrepresented. So government correspondence about how to deal with Anabaptists is all over the place. Interrogation records are all over the place. But sometimes a whole bunch of folks are brought in at the same time. And because some of them are Anabaptists, the authorities' starting assumption is that they're all Anabaptists, and through the course of the interrogations, some doubt is cast on that reality. But because some of them are, that gets tossed into the Anabaptist collection, which has led to some kind of labeling of certain folks as Anabaptists where we're not quite clear whether that's the case. Supplication. So there's a kind of bureaucratic means by which citizens of a territory can request favors from the governors. Those end up in these collections as well. So kind of the case file of certain Anabaptists' experience with the legal system. But these kinds of documents aren't kind of excerpted and later placed in those. So kind of I started with the low-hanging fruit, taking pictures of all these documents in these Anabaptist collections. It was only when I started casting a bit of a wider net, I realized how often they appeared in unexpected places, like these documents, which is kind of a whole other genre, which requires a whole other set of tools to interpret. But because I was interested in the relationship between Anabaptist and Reformed community, they were kind of invaluable. Yeah. Yes?
Why was, I guess his name was Stephen, why was he in front of court?
He made it a few times. Yeah, there's a number of reasons. He was actually an elected leader of the local Anabaptist community. So he was a legit Anabaptist, as close as you could get to that. And for that reason, he kept showing up. But he also had, his sons were troublemakers, and he was held responsible for them on a number of occasions. After he was arrested, they become antisocial, shooting off guns in the streets of the village at night, yelling at people who are going to church, drinking a lot in the tavern, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a mix of factors. In this instance, it was because he was opposed to the use of Zurich's Bible. He refused to recognize its authority. There had been an initial Froschauer Bible that Swiss Anabaptists accepted as authoritative. There's a later translation in Zurich that makes some changes to a number of key passages. And so they reject that subsequent Swiss Anabaptist, or that Zurich Bible, and have fights about it. So that's why he showed up at this point. Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes we know about opinions or documents through the fact that they're quoted in another document, but we may not have the original, and so we don't know, if that excerpt is representative in that. Do you find that sometimes that, oh, I really wish I had that, it seems to be referred to, but I don't know where it is, if it still exists?
Yeah, so there's a huge amount of duplication of documents just in normal bureaucratic practice, which ends up being great because the survival rate from documents of this time isn't good, right? So that constantly happens. There's constantly instances where you think you found something new and you go back to you spend an afternoon reading it and you realize you read it 4 months ago, it's the same document. So this bundle of documents, copies that I referenced earlier, some of those documents I can't find anywhere else, but certain ones I've found them in multiple archives. So yeah, that happens quite frequently. And initially, when I found 2 copies of a writing by Balthasar Hubmeier, who's an important early Swiss Anabaptist leader, with some differences, I thought, oh, exciting. Maybe there's kind of an interpretive opportunity here. But then I realized there were like 5 of them and the changes weren't significant at all. So yeah, there's some changes obviously occur in the process of copying. Yeah, there's constant references to documents that no longer exist and otherwise, yeah. Yeah.
David, you talked before about the way archives were weaponized. Is there any, did the official archives, are they repositories of selected Anabaptist writings that were sort of excerpted in ways that could be damaging? Today, politicians talk about having been taken out of context.
Mm-hmm.
So, was there a way of record-keeping of Anabaptist writings for which we have Anabaptist sources, so that we can see how those documents were, you might say, repurposed so as to serve as weapons against the Anabaptists? Sorry, that's complicated.
No, so both Anabaptists and Reformed constantly mischaracterize each other conveniently. But almost all these, and so statements that Anabaptists make in interrogation records are often weaponized against them. You said this. Just a brief aside, one of the major points of contention is whether Anabaptists will swear oaths or not. They say they will not, that their yes will be yes and their no will be no. But they often break that particular maxim. And so the authorities are constantly accusing them of saying things in the past that they'll no longer admit to. But there are all these examples of confiscated Anabaptist writings that I've talked about. There's almost no alteration of those. So the kind of conclusion I've come to on that is that the ethic to preserve is stronger than the ethic to mischaracterize. And because it was assumed that these would remain within the kind of secret archive of the authorities, it wouldn't matter anyway. Yeah.
I agree, Ron, that's a great comment.
Thank you.
And one thing, the tactic that the Dutch used sometimes was to make sure that they took copies out of the archives, they were notarized.
Mm.
The notary becomes their friend to say that this is something that really happened. I don't know if you saw that in Swiss cases too. The
Yeah.
other thing, my favorite thing that archivists do that's fun to watch is fighting about who gets to hold what.
This is a modern observation.
Zurich is one city, but are there different conversations in a more stronger state, stronger centralized power?
About how to operate the
Who gets to hold which things? Is it contested about who gets to keep the record?
Yeah, sure. So the Zurich Archive isn't centralized until the late 19th century. And the process of bringing together all the different collections that are literally distributed in dozens of different buildings all across the city is like a decades-long process because there's constant debate about whether we should hand over the documents to the city or not. So that's a contested process. On the first point, I don't see, there are increasingly sophisticated processes for proving a document is authentic or not. This hasn't reached that level of kind of sophistication yet in my reading of the evidence so far. Like, in other words, the authorities maintain a monopoly on being able to say what was true or not in a document. Yes?
Just as kind of a follow-up, were there power struggles between ecclesiastical records and civic records? Or did the state and church work kind of hand in glove? Or?
About as close as you can, this idea that, well, back then the church and the state were the same thing, which is an unhelpful characterization. In this case, it's not far from the truth. So state officials would attend meetings of the church synod. There were all kinds of high-ranking Reformed officials who got involved in different parts of the city's business. As I mentioned, this figure, Johann Jakob Breitinger, was basically the most important civic administrator in the city, even though he was in charge of the church. So there's an incredible amount of cooperation and sharing of documents in that regard. The church doesn't hand over even though a lot of church institutions have been secularized, in other words, they've been given over to the control of the city government, like the marriage court, for example, already very early on after the Reformation. The archives aren't handed over until that period, the late 19th century. So up until that point, all of this, these kinds of protocol books that I've just shown, that would have been part of the church archive. Yes?
You talked about this duality between pertinence, provenance, and archive is kind of intriguing. It's like the taxonomy, the difference between topicality versus authorship.
Right.
And what sort of in the period under talking about when did which become more prominent, more important?
So if this period 1400 to 1700 is this birth of the archive, that move towards provenance kind of begins to happen very near the end of that period of time. But it's only kind of enshrined as a basic principle when archivists begin to control huge state bureaucracies in the 19th century. Then it becomes kind of, in my understanding, and I'm ready to be corrected here, at that point it becomes kind of a base standard for how archives are organized.
So initially it was more by topic,
Mm-hmm.
and just because the profession, they changed to become more by authorship.
Yeah, but it also has to do with growing learning and understanding about what makes information most easily accessible. In other words, how can we inform the government most easily about past circumstances. That's why that transition gets made. It's about accessibility, at least in part. Ready to be corrected again. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how to put this, but I'd like to know, what is Zurich in your presentation? Is it a clearly delimited city, or does it include surrounding farms and what have you, villages and so on?
Yeah, it's a city republic, so it is a walled city on the kind of northwest edge of Lake Zurich, but it controls a significant territory that it had acquired over time via conquest, via purchase, etc. I don't have kind of square kilometers for you, but it's basically kind of pretty a large loop around Lake Zurich, from everything from kind of southern pre-Alpine region to the kind of getting close to what's today the German border, which is kind of more lowlands. And Anabaptists were concentrated mostly in those hilly pre-Alpine areas far away from the city. Yeah. So there's large rural areas. And there's obviously another part to the story, which is how the documents flow from these villages into the city. That's another part of the story as well. I think there was another question.
Can you speak a bit more to how your findings impact Anabaptist identity?
Well, the reason I use this separation example is I think there's an assumption that after this period of initial persecution, before this period of initial persecution, there's a broader vision of social transformation. There's a possibility even of making Anabaptist city-states or things like this. After this persecution, there's an assumption that Anabaptists withdrew in a way that led to their complete isolation from the rest of society. This, in some ways, became a family religion. I think some Anabaptist Mennonite groups would see that as a model to maintain. Others would see that as kind of maybe even a source of embarrassment, something to kind of turn the back on. But what's clear in this instance is even though there was a moral critique of society, there wasn't a kind of a closed attitude to the rest of society, in part because of just the demands of survival. But there's a certain tenacity here of maintaining beliefs and practices in a way that invited persecution, but without kind of totally shutting down. So these conversations with Reformed ministers continue during this entire period of time. There's a surprising amount of integration of new members into these communities. It's full of converts throughout the time that we're talking about. This is not a faith that's passed down within families. There are a few examples of that, but generally speaking, it's fairly dynamic. So I think kind of questioning that origin story has certain implications for the way that Mennonites today think about themselves, what the scope of their vision is, how that aligns with the early history of the movement, etc. Yeah.
A couple of times you noted that children of the leaders were, quote, troublemakers. and I'm trying to understand what you meant by that, this particular illustration. The question that I have is, how well were these people, these Anabaptists, capable of passing on their faith to the next generation? Or were the next generation ready to turn their backs?
Yeah, that links to my earlier response. It's a mixed bag, but there are certain kind of pressures that they're under. All kids had to be sent to not Sunday school, but Saturday school, okay? There was obligatory religious instruction at the church. Not sending your kid to that was basically admitting to your objection to the kind of key institutions of your society. So there are many cases in which Anabaptist families sent their kids to these Reformed catechetical classes as a way of getting by. So that's one example that would make it difficult. In this Sander example that I talked about, it's not a kind of, once the father is arrested, it's not a kind of general pattern of antisocial behavior. It's targeted against certain Reformed figures of authority or certain patterns of Reformed religious life. So even there's some evidence of certain characteristics being passed along. But especially after this 1635 to 1645 persecution campaign, there's widespread, whatever word you want to use, reconversion or reintegration into Reformed religious life. A lot of folks leave, but a lot of folks stay behind and just said it was too intense and continue on in the Reformed Church with inner reservations or without. It's hard to say.
Maybe we'll wrap it up then.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, David. It strikes me that your research is painstaking, detailed, and probably frustrating sometimes. And yet you're able to extract these new ideas and brilliant interpretations, and we look forward to hearing more from you about how we can apply the reading of documents to how we think about Anabaptists then and now. So we wish you well and thank you.
Thank you.
For sharing with us tonight.